It's a special pleasure to be here. It feels like being back home. In a way, this is where I did my PhD. This is where consciousness is one of those topics where it's a little bit weird. So I think that as a Chilean, we, gave us opportunity to really study that. And it was back in the day when I was doing my PhD at the Universidad Católica de Chile with Eugenio Rodriguez. And, it was one of those really rare moments, where we thought, okay, you know what, maybe, we could do this in Chile. Because in most other places, it was like a taboo topic, right? Now it became on vogue. There is a lot of researchers really doing that. So I'm kind of like in my way back. So now today I'm going to tell you what are the problems that I found in that journey, and what are the challenges that I think we face now. So now we have the topic on the table, now we are allowed to study it, and now we actually have to make sure that we do it right, because we're doing a lot of things wrong. And that's why my talk is going to be, Distilling Binocular Consciousness, because I really think that we are not doing a really good job. So why, first of all, what's going to be the roadmap for today? So first, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of how we study empirically the neurocorrelates of consciousness. Then I'm going to try to briefly discuss with you, and you may actually disagree, and actually would be really cool, to hear your opinion, as to whether we have or not a fundamental problem. And then I'm going to give some really humble ideas as of how we could possibly solve it. And finally, I'm going to go back to the theories that we have so far, and I'm going to try to deconstruct them and say, like, hey, okay, we have fairly good theories, but how good do they fare once we really try to understand whether they are really studying what we think they were studying? And Pepe started by asking before, how could we give definition of consciousness? And every time I actually think about that, at least from my point of view, I think that this is one of the most obvious things. Whenever I fall asleep, I lose it. Whenever I wake up, I regain it. So I kind of every time somebody asks me, I say, how do you study that? It's like, how do you study perception? How do you study memory? I have no clue how you do that. Because seriously, I know every day when I lose it and when I gain it. So it's fairly obvious. So I do think that in that sense, it's not such a really weird topic, because we know very well how it feels to be conscious. It has, however, certain challenges. And it's the fact that it's kind of private. So I know how I feel, but I'm pretty sure that, you may not know how I feel, right? Or you may not know how my computer feels, if it were to feel anyways, right? And that's the idea of the inner mind. And that's actually one of the biggest problems that we have when we try to study this empirically. How do I know that my subjects, when they come to the lab, or whenever somebody, loses consciousness in anesthesia, they have actually really lost it, right? I think Christoph and Giulio Tononi are now in this idea, could computers be conscious? How could we actually tell? We don't know, right? And that's the challenge that we face. And the thing behind that is that also we do know that we have something like two different processors. So there's a part of our mind that is aware, and there's another part of our mind that is not aware. And these are cases that we see all the time. Sometimes people have strokes and they lose part of their B1, which is the primary visual cortex, and they walk around and they say, you know what, I don't see. And you ask them, how so? And then you flash them an image, and they say, oh, I don't see it, but I can tell you that it was moving upwards. And so oh, how come? How come? I mean, seriously, you just told me that you didn't see it. Well, those people can do fairly complicated things. They can detect stimuli if you flash them. They can localize them. They can tell it's up or down or left or right. They can even identify some of them. But what is interesting is that every time you ask them, did you see that? They will tell you no. And what is interesting there is that that's where the suffering is, because they can't see, right? So by any means, and by all the means that we know, they actually are very good unconscious processors. They have all the capacity to, the information gets somehow to their brain, but it just gets lost into consciousness. And I'm going to give you one example. There is one case called GY. This is a patient who had, I think he was in an accident actually when he was 7 years old or so, and he's probably the most studied patient. I'm going to give you first impressions of how that person feels. And what you're going to see is a video that Larry Weisskranz, I think that this was in 1978. And he's going to flash a pointer, like say up, down, left, right, and diagonals. And he's going to ask GY to raise his hands in the direction in which the pointer goes, right? And you're going to see that in the video that he can do it fairly well. And then sometimes he can't. And then he's going to give you his own experiences of, how he feels under that task.
Okay, now.
Can you see the pointer? He's doing it slower now, right? So not as fast as before.
Can you tell me what sort of experience you had that made you move your arm?
I just know something's moving over in the right field.
Can you describe it?
No, it's just I know there's some movement there.
And what did you actually see?
I didn't see anything.
Just an impression?
It was just, I was aware that there was an object moving, yes.
Yeah. But could you describe the object?
No.
Okay, thank you.
And that's what we typically see, right? So we actually do know that among us, there's something like those zombies that Chalmers had described. So people that can do things, but nonetheless they cannot see. And this is not just, this person suffered from a stroke, and his V1 was actually lesion. But we also have experimental ways whereby we can delete consciousness, and one of those is masking. I don't know if you know what it is, but it's a very simple technique where if I flash a stimuli very quickly, by certain parameters, there's some of those that you cannot see. What is interesting is that what researchers have found over and over again is that, for instance, in this case, if I show you the letter 9 that is mask, and then I ask you to tell me whether this number was bigger or smaller than 6, if it was preceded by the very same number, so in this case 9 and 6, so it's bigger than 5, both of them, you're going to be faster than the other way around. What that tells, in turn, is that subjects, even though they have not registered into awareness those stimuli, they can actually process them and change their behavior accordingly. And when Sandham did this experiment, almost 20 years ago, he also recorded EEG. And he looked at the so-called lateralized readiness potential, which is like you put 2 electrodes here, and you look at, you can trace by that which hand started to be activated, right? And what he did something really, really clever. So he said, okay, if you're going to press this one for smaller than 5, and this one for bigger than 5, right? So when they are incongruent, you should actually have 2 different signals, right? Even though the first stimuli, the subject never ever saw it. And when they are congruent, both of them actually should be raised in the same direction. What he found out is that even though subjects claim that they never ever saw anything, their motor cortex could track very well which decisions they were actually making, even though they actually didn't see anything. Right? So it's not just subjects that have blind sight that can have these unconscious capacities. We also have them, right? Each and every one of us, right? And this actually poses the question: well, what does it mean for the brain to have awareness? Right? And Christoph Koch, many years ago, came up with a very simple definition, which is, if one wants to find out what in the brain relates to consciousness, one has to find the minimal set of neural events that jointly are sufficient, and this is an important word, for a specific conscious experience, given the appropriate enabled conditions. And what that means is that, of course, you have to have a brain that is, somebody who's breathing, right? So, of course, you won't have somebody, you can't study the brain if somebody's not breathing. That's the so-called enabling condition. And the idea here is that you should actually find something in the world that activates something in the brain that is very specific and creates this conscious percept. Right? And for many years, the quest for the neurocortex consciousness was fairly simple. So let's just try to contrast cases where you see something versus cases where you don't see something. And that's the so-called contrastive method. And we're going to actually rehearse what that logic is. But before that, I want to just rehearse with you this important diagram, which is when we try to investigate awareness, we have two axes. One is the level of consciousness, which is what Patrick was mentioning before. So sometimes we are in coma, we have very little awareness. We are in deep anesthesia, we have very little awareness, but we are awake, or not in REM sleep, and we have a high level of awareness. Right? On the other axis, we have here the content, which is like what is in our mind. Because what Patrick, for instance, or Pepe didn't tell you before is that when we track the anesthesia, we don't necessarily track the content. You could have actually, imagine that you wake up in anesthesia. You could have dreamed with your mom, with your grandmother, or with anything else, and it would have been probably the same response. When people try to investigate the content of awareness, is what is in your mind now? Are you smelling this? Are you hearing that? Are you seeing that? And that's different. And there is actually very interesting cases, like for instance, the locked-in syndrome. So those are people, interesting cases, but probably terrifying cases. Those are people that have high level of awareness, so by all means they are awake. They have high level of contents of awareness, so they really experience everything, but they cannot move. So we are deceived. We think that they actually don't experience anything. And that, this is where I think that studying consciousness has important consequences, because if I were to be in that case, I would really want someone to know that I'm there. And at the same time, here, when you are in general anesthesia, okay, you have low level of arousal, unless you have low content, right? But imagine a situation where you actually get paralyzed, right? So you cannot move again, but imagine that you're super awake and you're feeling, you are having all these sensations. I also wouldn't want to be there, right? So it's actually pretty relevant to study this, even though some people think that it's a little bit mysterious. So the talk that I'm going to give today is mostly about how do we find out what the contents of awareness are, right? But the methodologies that we use are actually the same. The contrastive method is in essence the same thing. So whenever you want to know, what does it mean to be in deep anesthesia, you contrast that with, what it means to be awake. So it's the same contrast. You always have, consciousness there, consciousness not there. And the idea there is actually something very simple. This is more like a philosophical thing that we did with a PhD student of mine, which is, okay, let's just think what the contrastive method is. And the idea is super simple, right? That's the problem. Like, imagine I flash you a stimuli, in this case, his face, right? And in certain cases, you're going to have a conscious experience, and in some others, you won't, right? And I ask you to press a button, because as an experimenter, I need to know, right? So you say, oh, okay, I did perceive it here, I didn't perceive it there. So then we say, okay, that's fairly simple. So we think that in one case, consciousness was there in the brain, and in the other case, consciousness wasn't there in the brain, right? And so we classify the trials between the aware trials and the unaware trials. And then the logic is, okay, just subtract one. In the logic of simple addition, in one case, whatever is the difference between these two is this minimal set of neural activity that gave rise to consciousness. Fairly simple. So everybody use it, right? Why not? And this logic is for each and every experiment that psychologists have run for the past 30 years. So if you have done a masking experiment, which is the one that I mentioned before, where you flash stimuli very quickly, or if you do continuous flash suppression, which is another technique that you use to erase stimulus from awareness, or say binocular fusion or binocular rivalry, where you flash to stimuli to the eyes, and then the eyes, or the perception actually switches from one to the other, you name it. anything that psychologists use that logic, right? And it's the same, by the way, that we use to investigate level of consciousness, right? So we think, okay, in one case you are aware, in the other case you weren't, right? What is the difference? And I'm going to actually walk you through 4 different theories that are based on those on that simple paradigm. Why? Because those are probably the 4 most recognized theories currently. And then we're going to briefly mention what the problem is and try to go back and see, like, did they ever investigate consciousness? So one of those is by Stan DeHaan, and his idea is actually fairly simple. So what he thinks is that we have, imagine that this is the brain, this is the back part of the brain, this is the front part of the brain, and so he thinks, well, we have to explain how come that the brain can actually perceive stimuli or register stimuli but not having consciousness, versus a case where the stimuli are there and my brain registered them, but I'm also aware. Right? And his idea is that in the case where you have subliminal perception or unconscious processing, the activity just has a feed-forward processing. So it goes from the back of the brain, it just spreads towards the front, but at some point kind of like washes up, it vanishes, right? The difference with consciousness is that there is this idea of global workspace, where neurons in different areas of the brain, they become active at the same time. And they enter into this kind of like Cartesian theater, right? So they enter into awareness, and that generates a boost in processing. So he thinks that every time we have conscious processing, we have this nonlinear activity, which resembles also what Patty was mentioning regarding the loss of consciousness, right? So it's a nonlinear process. Different areas of the brain are active, and then suddenly all of them are doing something specific. And they have actually looked at, tons of EEGs, images, MRIs, and what they systematically find over the years is something like this. So if you look at the activity in the brain, and this is EEG, for the first, say, 300 milliseconds, it's in essence the same. You cannot tell where the subject will see or won't see the stimuli. It's really, really the same. But then something interesting happens. Around 300 milliseconds, if you are aware, you have one kind of activity, and if you aren't, you have another kind of activity. It generates this bifurcation, this complete nonlinear dynamics, right? And that's the idea of actually getting into this global workspace. To the point that now, Sid Coulier, a couple of years ago, he said, well, because, how could we tell that babies have consciousness? I mean, when I ask my son, by all means, I hope that he does, but I'm really not sure. So he thought, well, since we cannot ask them, how about, we run the very same experiment, we put the EEG, and we see where they have the same activity that, adults would have. And sure enough, he found that. So what happens is that at the very, in this case, the baby's brain are actually slower. So this is all like, in around 300 milliseconds would happen in adults. In babies happens like around 700 milliseconds, kind of like slower, right? But other than that, it's more or less the same dynamics. So if you present stimuli to the babies, for the first, say, 700 milliseconds, all the stimuli are the same, right? But around, in this case, a second, now the ones that the babies we think should have seen, because they were flashed for longer time, have certain activities, and the ones that were flashed for very short time that are impossible to see have a different activity. And this is in essence the very same, as you see here, this is the very same bifurcation that the group of Stan DeHaan found before. So by their account, the difference between being aware and not being aware is actually activating this global workspace. And the signature of that is this very late activity around 300 milliseconds. The other theory is by Victor Lame. It's recurrent processing. So what he thinks in this case is that, again, you have the feed-forward sweep. So the activity goes from the back of the brain towards the front of the brain. But now the key and magic ingredient is that the activity has to go, say, from higher areas to lower areas. It has to feed back. And whenever you have the feedback, consciousness is there, right? And he's making a distinction between the so-called phenomenal awareness, which is the sensations that we have, versus access consciousness, which is, I can tell you that I was aware. Because you can also think of scenarios where I was aware, I have the feeling, but then you ask me and I forgot. I would say that I was aware anyways, even if I had forgotten later on, right? Or imagine you're in a locked-in syndrome. You cannot really, give me any motor response. Right? And in his account, the key ingredient is just having feedback. And he has run beautiful experiments in monkeys where he showed, for instance, this kind of stimuli. So there's this square, there is this background where there is nothing, and then what he sees is that if there is the figure on the foreground, there's a distinction, there's a difference there. Only there's a difference that actually is only due to feedback. And then he actually finds the same when he asks his monkeys whether they are aware or not. In this case, did the monkey saw that image or not? They did even more interesting experiments because if you can pull, say V2, so you can impair the feedback responses. And then this activity that he sees later on, which is the signature of recurrent activity, is not there. And they think that this is also the same reason why masking actually works. Because the idea of masking is that I present you a stimuli, I present you another one later on, and thereby you cannot see the one that you saw that you presented before, right? And the idea that they have here is that imagine that you present the very first stimuli, it goes, from say V1 to V4, but then by the time V4 has to feed back to V1, you're now seeing the next stimuli. Therefore, you're blocking, right? And that would explain why we cannot see under masking conditions. And they have a ton of really beautiful experiments, where they have shown that there's this signature of recurrent activity with EEG, MEG, as well as with single neural recordings in V1 that seems to actually be the hallmark, at least in their hands, for consciousness. The third one that I happen to be working on, or I was working most, is Synchrony. And this is an idea that Walt Singer many years ago actually stumbled upon. He wasn't really looking for it. He just happened to, have a good eye, right? So they were recording neurons, in V1, and they saw that, whenever imagine that you actually have, like two bars that move, like in the same orientation, right? So then thereby they make the very same object. What they found out is that neurons in V1, when you have the perception of them being a unified object, they would spike, they would have their fire rate at the same time, right? And this is the idea of synchrony, right? And this is just to give you a cartoonish of this. This is the so-called face-based stimuli, if you can see it. So you can either see two faces, two profile faces, or a base, you see? And the idea here is that you can transit it from one percept to the other by just synchronizing pool of neurons differently. So if you have, imagine now these 4 pool of neurons and they are all synchronous, you're going to see the base. Now, if you have these 2 pools of neurons spiking at the same time, but different from these other 2 pool of neurons, then you're going to see now 2 faces, right? So then the idea here is that neurons are actually pretty smart. Because, you can have the very same neuron spiking, but it's just about what this neuron does in relationship to some other neuron that determines what you have perceived, right? So it's a fairly, cool mechanism because it's very flexible, right? And Francisco Varela took on this and says, well, we actually think that this happens at the level of the areas. Not necessarily at the level of one area and different neurons, but across areas. So now if, say the back and the front are synchronized, then we are aware. And if they aren't, then we're not aware. Mm-hmm. And there is actually, fairly good evidence for that. The first was by the group of Giulio Tononi. They were looking at binocular rivalry. So they were presenting 2 different images to the eyes, and the perception was translated from one to the other. And what they saw is that there was, in this case, these lines that you see here, they were measuring magnetoencephalography, and there was synchrony only when the subjects were perceiving one stimuli. And it was different than when they were perceiving another stimuli. Years later, we did the very same experiment, but in this case was with masking. So we show subjects stimuli that were, presented very briefly, so the subjects couldn't tell. Actually, you would ask them, did you see the stimuli? And then they would say, which one? I had only one guy. He happened to be, doing, electron microscopy or so. So he was, he had all this perceptual learning, in his eye. And he said, which one do I have to respond to? I said, what? Anyway, so he was 1 out of, 30 that we measured. But by all means, all the others said, well, I only saw the second stimuli. I only saw one stimuli, right? And what we found out is that in the case when they were seeing something, we had this long distance synchrony. And when they weren't seeing anything, the synchrony was actually much, much, much reduced. And the third example is something that, again, the group of Sandehan did, much nicer. They actually recruited patients that had epilepsy. So now they have electrodes in their brain. So you're really measuring brain signals from within, right? Not from outside, like in the case of the EEG or the imaging. And they, in essence, found exactly the same. So they ran the masking experiment, and they found that whenever subjects had, they perceived a stimuli, they had increase in synchrony. So it seems to me that, at least we have some evidence from different groups that synchrony may actually be interesting for consciousness. And the last one is from the group of Rafi Malach. And what these guys did was something also pretty interesting. They used masking. They again recruited patients that have epilepsy with electrodes in their brain, and they flashed images, right? And they looked at, what happened in the so-called high gamma band responses. The high gamma band responses, we don't really know 100% what they are, but what people believe they are is a proxy for multi-unit activity, which is otherwise something that we cannot measure, from outside the brain. And what they found out is that whenever the subject saw the phase, this high gamma band response was far larger than when the subject did not see the phase. And they call this neural ignition. And the idea here is that much like consciousness is a nonlinear phenomenon, where, if I show you a stimuli for 1 millisecond, you don't see it. Sometimes I show it again for 1 millisecond, you don't see it. But if I show it for 10, you will see it. Right? Completely nonlinear. They actually thought, okay, maybe what explains consciousness is that it's the same neurons, but in one case, they actually have much more responses. So in this case, you can think of something like a threshold, right? So you go, it's like a spike. You have certain membrane potential, nothing happened, then you hit certain value, everything happens, right? And that's the same that they have been postulating here. So far so good. So we actually, we made quite some progress in the past 20 years. So now we are not lacking theories. When I started, doing my PhD, we were lacking theories. It was the hand and, whatever, a few, right? Now, we have probably too many. And the problem, and the problem with that is that even though this contrastive analysis seems powerful and simple enough, it has, in my view, a tremendous issue, which is the following. You can also think that there is something called precursors, which is that, well, there must have been. So if in one case I did not see the stimuli, and in the other case I did see the stimuli, there must have been something in my brain different beforehand that set the brain such that I saw it in one case and I didn't in the other. Isn't that obvious? And we thought, okay, what could it be a precursor? And actually there's plenty that could be. So one of those is the activity before a stimulus comes, the activity in the baseline. And actually some researchers, in this case, this is an experiment from the group of Catherine Talon-Baudry, they looked at, they collected magnetoencephalography, which is like a very expensive version of an EEG, and they did source analysis. And they look into this case at what is activity in the gamma range in the visual cortex before the stimulus was presented. And in purple, the more like solid purple, is the trials in which the subject saw the stimuli, and in these ones is the trials in which the subjects did not see the stimuli. And the stimuli will happen at 0, right? It won't happen before, right? It happened at 0. What they found out is that the trials in which the subject did see the stimuli were even higher before the subject saw it. So it was what the brain was doing before what set the stage for what the brain was doing later, right? And they build up a model, so they can predict under which conditions the subjects would actually see, just based on, what was the state of your brain beforehand. Right? We did something, these are just random fluctuations, so we don't know, I'm giving you this example just to tell you that, there is something more complex than just this minimal contrast analysis, right? Because in this minimal contrast analysis, these would actually be lumped in together, right? And this is something that we don't have any experimental control on. But there is some others in which we do have some controls of. And so we ran, years later, some other studies in which we thought, okay, what we do know is that I can either put a stimuli into your consciousness because I ramp up the sensory evidence. So imagine that, you dial something, like it's very, very dark, and then, you start tuning it in, and then you can see it. at some point you're going to start seeing it. That's the idea of sensory evidence, right? But we also all know that if you know what to look for, sometimes even very minimal sensory evidence would allow you to see something just because you know what to search, right? So now the question was, well, you know what? I mean, in my view, you end up having the same consciousness. You just came from different places, right? Either from dialing in the sensory evidence or from having a memory that would actually guide your perception. If a real correlate is there, it should be the same under any circumstance, right? Well, it wasn't the case. So some people actually had thought that, that the activity around 100 milliseconds could reflect awareness. And this was done based on studies like this. So they were showing stimuli with certain levels of sensory stimulation. They would have some in which the subject would see the stimuli, some in which the subject wouldn't see the stimuli. They would say, oh, there is a difference. That's the neural correlate of consciousness. So far, so good, right? Well, we repeat the same experiment, but now in this case, we said, well, what if we now give the subjects an expectation? We will tell them what to look for, right? Now this distinction there between the seen and the unseen twice was gone. So now we call those the precursors. This activity that can be different, that can help in bringing a stimuli into awareness, but it has nothing to do with consciousness. Right? And what could be a precursor? Expectations, attention. We know that actually this is what attention does. So if I focus my attention here, I can boost stimuli. Stimulus strength, stochastic fluctuation, you name it. We actually don't know. We just know that we have a problem. Next problem. So if we think that consciousness does something to the brain, it has certain functions, also the activity after it was aware should be different, right? Because, it's obvious. Like, if it has a function, then, something was triggered after this element was present, and it wasn't triggered, after that element wasn't present. And there is actually very interesting evidence for that, and one of those is this one. So many years ago, the group of Rodrigo and Quiroga, they actually implant electrodes in people's hippocampus. In this case, these are patients that have epilepsy, and they ran this beautiful masking experiment. So they presented the stimuli for, say, like 16 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, 100, and so on and so forth, and they record how many times the subject was aware versus wasn't. Now they have access to single units in the hippocampus in humans, and they look at, what was their firing rate whenever the subject saw the stimuli. Well, what they found out is that if you present the stimuli for 33 milliseconds, but the subject sees it, which is whenever here is red, the neurons spike. And if you don't see it, the neuron is silent, right? And the longer you present the stimuli, the more aware trials you have, because it's easier to see them, right? So in this case, they have all the time the neurons actually spike. And the paper was called that the neurons in the hippocampus could track awareness. And I thought, that's a super cool finding. Until I stumbled upon, if you look at the raster, at the average activity, this is what you would say. So in the case of the recognized stimuli, there was a huge increase in firing rate. If you don't see it, there is nothing, right? Well, the issue is that, we also know there's this guy called HM. I don't know if you know him. He's a very, very famous patient whose hippocampus was removed bilaterally. What happened to him was that he was not able to have any more memories after the surgery. And then also he lost some memories before. The point is that even though he couldn't, get any memories after the surgery, he could still keep awareness. So I thought, how could the hippocampus be so important for consciousness if you can actually resect both? And, and this guy was still aware. And then we said, well, there's something like the consequences, right? Which is that it's true. Every time we see something, we record that in episodic memory. So the stage afterwards would actually get that information. And, if you remove the stage afterwards, it won't change, your perception. It will just change the fact whether you can memorize it or not, right? So again, we are going to have now, many, many cases in which you can actually have more consequences. Report can be one of those, right? If I have a percept and then I ask you to push a button, that activity will actually generate activity in my brain, which would also be different. But it's nothing to do with awareness. I would have asked you to report with your eyes, with your mouth, with your tongue. It will all be different. it will be there. And in my contrast, it will actually still be there. And so you can think of, like say, working memory, report, long-term encoding, novelty. If I see something, well, it attracts my attention. Error monitoring, because I think, oops, this wasn't what I was expecting to see. Right? So there is many consequences. So the point that we tried to make with Jan some years ago is that this simple minimal contrast, which seems so great, may not be. And it may not be because we're actually getting far more than what we want. We're getting 3 NCCs. The precursors to consciousness, the consciousness itself, as well as the consequences. So is there a way out? Maybe. Literally, I know it was easier as usual, to recognize that we have a problem and to fix it. We have some ideas how one can go about that, but I think this is something that as a community we really have to think hard. What we do think, however, is that we definitely need new experimental paradigms. And one of the ideas that we thought, very simply, is like, look at the main effect of visibility. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean is that imagine that now you run an experiment in which you put a stimulant into consciousness because you ramp up the sensory evidence, or because you put attention. You end up having the same percept, but the precursors should be different, right? Or expectations, right? So now you really want to have that very same activity regardless of how consciousness came about. Right? And the same with the consequences. So in some of the cases you could say, well, you know what, imagine that I present you stimuli before, so you don't have to encode into memory because you had it before in memory. So, okay, I remove, like the memory part. Or you know what, I don't ask you to report because I know that the report will actually be different. Right? So the idea is to really distill, and try to, remove all the recent variables and try to get with what is relevant. And this is one possibility. There is others. The second one is maybe we can exploit the gradual variation of the quality of the experience. And what we know by that is that it seems that consciousness is non-linear. It's like I don't see, and then suddenly I see, right? So we can take those profiles of activity to look in the brain for those kind of responses. Also, look at the fine-grained variations of the contents. And this is something that Francisco Varela was and too bad that he died so young, but he was trying to push us to really do good phenomenology. Because maybe actually looking at that, how can, by looking at the phenomenology itself and how that relates to the response in the brain, we can probably have much more information than just like was conscious there or wasn't there. Right? Changing consciousness with learning. This is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but I really am a believer that if once one understands a system, has to gain control over it, right? And the idea is that instead of actually just having random variations between being aware and not being aware, I think we need to teach people to be conscious. A, because it's going to be therapeutic in the case of blindness, but B, because we can track the learning process and see what has changed in people's brain as a function of they learning to see. And the fifth, which is probably obvious, is like, let's just stop, looking at the correlates, and why don't we just try to look at the mechanism? Why don't we have mechanistic hypotheses? And a lot of people, think that Julia Tononi's hypothesis is bad. It may be, but this has a mechanism. There is very few that actually have that flavor. And the last one is the so-called no report paradigm. This is people from Göttingen and some other people like Victor Lame, that they say, well, why don't you look at things that do not rely on report? And they actually propose a thing called pupillometry. So in this case, they look at the pupil dilation as a proxy of where the subject would see one image or the other, right? And they actually, what was really interesting when they ran those studies is that they got rid of all the frontoparietal network, which a lot of research has shown that supposedly is important for consciousness, right? And maybe actually that network was always important to report, and not actually for consciousness. What we have been working on is in this kind of technique, which I'm really, really excited about, is the so-called frequency tagging. And you may actually be familiar with the frequency tagging of flashing. So if I present you a stimuli, say at 10 hertz, your brain resonates at those 10 hertz, right? But that is something driven by the stimuli. So in a way, it's kind of like not very smart, because it's like, okay, I'm just, like getting you like some kind of like epilepsy with the stimuli, right? But you can also think of, what if I deliver the information that the brain is processing at a particular frequency? And then I look how the brain should react to those mental operations. Imagine I present something like 2 plus 2 equal 4, 2 plus 2 equal 4, 2 plus 2 equal 4. Eventually you would have something like, well, 2 plus 2 is one thing, equal 4 would be something else, right? So you can now look at, like how the brain is actually activating its internal representations. And to get at that, we did something that is, we started with the simpler case, which is language. In language, we know that we have different levels of representation. So we have the level of the words, we have the level of the phrases, and we level of the sentences, right? Now, what we did in this case was that we presented the stimuli 4 words in 1 second. Of those, 2 would make a noun phrase, and 2 other would make a verb phrase. And then the 4 of them would make a sentence, right? And then we, just ask the subjects to line the EMG or epilepsy patients, and we ask them to just hear these stimuli. They would go like one after another, something like this. This is Chinese, so you won't understand it, but.
军队撤退清发芽工资张一看病。
Sorry. So if you were to be Chinese, you would understand that, like it's super fast, but you would be understanding what actually I'm saying, right? And the idea was that, okay, if I am actually presenting the words at 4 hertz, the phrases at 2 hertz, and the sentences at 1 hertz, now I should actually have a brain response that really tracks the very same rhythms. And sure enough, it happens. So now if you look at the spectrum in this case, you have the response to the syllable, the response to the phrase, and the response to the sentence in your spectrum, right? But if you don't understand that language, you have nothing, which is obvious, right? I mean, if you're not understanding, then you shouldn't be activating the next level of representations, right? So in this case, this is Chinese present to Chinese speakers, and this is Chinese present to English speakers. But we did also the other way around, right? So English sentences to English speakers, and English sentences to Chinese speakers, right? So now what I find extremely exciting about this is that now we can use these kind of techniques to ask babies, how much language do you get? People that are minimally conscious, are you understanding something? Right? People in anesthesia, are you getting anything? Right? So now we can use the people's brain to actually look, like, wait, what are you understanding now? Right? What is pretty cool about this technique is that it's something that you see in every single subject. Because one of the, I don't know how many of you do like human research, but I do human research, and one of my biggest concerns is that you have something in the average, but you ask for a single subject, like, do I see this response? And you don't. And that's pretty darn, problematic, right? Because you want to have in one particular case, like, did you see it, did you not? Did you understand, did you not, right? With this technique, you can track everybody. So we think that, this is probably something, I'm not saying that we are there yet, but I'm just giving you as a, teaser, like, this is something that we could probably develop. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. We try to use the technique, this distillation process, to test the different theories and say, okay, how many of those really were investigating consciousness, right? And the first that we did was the neural ignition. So I showed you before that Rafi Malak did this beautiful experiment where he showed stimuli, and whenever the subject saw it, they would have this increase in gamma, and whenever the subject didn't see it, they would have no increases in gamma, right? So we did this they did with epilepsy patients. So they would present them a phase, they would mask it, then they would have a verbal response, and then the patterns of response is that, okay, there is high gamma when they see it, lower when they don't. And we thought, okay, so now let's just do something, let's just repeat their experiment, also with people that have epilepsy, also with electrodes in people's brain. But now we're going to have consciousness either because the images are less masked, so now you can see them, right? Or because I show you before an image, so now you know what to look for. So what would happen is that if I give you the image before, it will boost your perception to the very same extent, right? So now the very simple prediction is that if they were right, we should have the very same difference in responses, regardless of how consciousness came about. regardless of whether it was because we ramp up the sensory evidence or because we gave people an expectation. So this would be the factor of sensory evidence, so the yellow and the green. This would be the factor of prior knowledge. And I'm not going to go there. So the point is that behaviorally, we have the very same difference in perception for sensory evidence as compared for prior knowledge. So we know that we actually have two main factors, right? And it's the same difference behaviorally, right? And we looked at this is a pattern of high gamma band responses, and again we replicated what they actually had done before. So if you see a stimuli, it's higher. If you don't, it's lower, right? And now, we looked at, okay, we're going to look at, whether we have this difference when we look at sensory evidence versus when we look at prior knowledge. And what happens is that difference is there when you have a change in sensory evidence, but not when you have a change in prior knowledge. So we know that there's these two curves in the brain, in people's brain are different, in people's perception are different. In one case they saw something, in the other case they didn't, but their brain made zero distinction. And this is something that we saw in, tons of the electrodes that we actually looked in the brain. So in my view, this tells us that, maybe they were measuring something, but it wasn't really consciousness. It could have been changes in, luminance. It could have been changes in whatever, sensory evidence. I can't tell you what they were measuring, but I don't think they were measuring consciousness. Next, we actually looked at the idea that Stan DeHaan actually had, which was that the correlates of awareness were always late. So the first 300 milliseconds would be just for, unconscious processing. Around 300 milliseconds, we would have this broadcasting, right? And we ran an experiment actually fairly similar to what they actually had before. So we ramp up stimuli, and the only difference was that either we ramp them up, from say like not seeing anything, up to the point where you see everything, right? But the issue is that once you see everything, then you know what to look for. And now we actually ramp them down. That's called hysteresis. And what happens is that every smart physical system has like an inertia. And what that means is that the thresholds for seeing once you know what to look for are different. You actually see more in the case when you don't have the sensory evidence. And this also came from the idea that I thought, well, how come that the brain will always respond at 300 milliseconds when we all have this subjective experience that if we know what to look for, things become easier. Like we have the sense that they are faster. So I thought, okay, this was led by intuition, but I thought maybe in the brain the same happens. Maybe the correlates actually move in time depending on where I know something or I don't. And as I said, so the idea here was to look for in essence, this distinction that they would have at 300 milliseconds. This is the paradigm that we ran before, sorry. So we would run the stimuli. In this case, these were letters, right? And they would come either from, you don't see anything, and then an A starts appearing, right? And up to this point, you know that it was an A. And I would start making it to disappear, right? And we would measure, in this case, the EEG activity at every single time point. What that happens in terms of threshold is that if you look at the psychometric function, when you don't know what to look for, the point of subjective equality or the point of perception is different when you don't have an expectation versus when you do have an expectation. The curve shifts. This is the so-called hysteresis effect, right? Now, what is neat about this in this case here, and look at this, is that if you don't know what to look for, how much stimulation your brain needs is around, say, like a level of 4. But if your brain knows what to look for, a level of 3, which is far less information, would lead to the very same, perceptual response, right? So what is beautiful about here is that we have the same perception. We have equalized perception, but we know that we got there in very different ways, right? And we replicate actually what Stan DeHaan has actually studied before. So around 300 milliseconds, there is a difference between the seen stimuli and the unseen stimuli in cases when your perception is driven by sensory evidence only, right? So when you don't know what to look for. Now, if I tell you what to look for, your brain will have the very same distinction 100 milliseconds earlier. So it actually became smarter by 100 milliseconds, right? So I think that the take-home message from this is actually, in my case, in my view, very, very important, which is like, A, the brain responses are a mobile target. They can change in time, right? So just looking at something that always occurs at a particular latency may not be the right thing to go for. But also the brain is smart. It can get there in many different ways, right? And we have to be smarter than, than we're trying to measure, right? And third, we repeated the experiment in the EMG because even though it's a more expensive machine, it also has a better localization. So we can actually localize responses in a better way. And what we also found is that it not only the brain responds in a faster way, it also activates less neurons, right? So if you don't know what to look for, this is the kind of responses that you would have. If the brain knows what to look for, this is the kind of response that the brain has. What is neat about here is that it activates V1 and the visual warm form area, which are the two areas that you would expect to activate because we're dealing with letters, right? Whereas there is a ton of other activity that you see here that is not present whenever the subject knows what to look for. Right? So just in simple, what I'm trying to get at is that I think that looking for the late correlates was probably not the right thing because maybe we're dealing with something else, right? Maybe we have to, be smart in terms of the methodology. But B, that also that even the signatures actually may change, right? So the problem may be a little bit more complicated than we thought before. So what do we have to? So what at least in my mental list is like the to-do. We need to reassess the current theories that we have in light of this 3 NCC problem and see how many of those actually are really dealing with the NCCs or the neurocorrelates consciousness as opposed to something else. We need to develop different methodologies that go beyond because the one that we were using was just far too simple. And probably, and most importantly, maybe it's time to really move to the theories, and kind of like stop by just, doing correlations, right? Because we can correlate many things, but at some point we also need to explain, right? And with that, I just want to thank you and also the people that have helped me here. So Websinger, Anna Meyer, Anna and Jana were two terrific PhD students. Eugenio was my PhD advisor and Marcel as well. And they were instrumental in actually making me to think about consciousness and also fail. And they taught me a lot about this thing. And Casper, who helped me with your studies. Okay, thanks.
So thank you for a brilliant presentation. I think you've done a wonderful job of actually taking this simple question and sort of breaking it down in this way that we can kind of get more deeply into it with the sort of prior conditions as well as the consequences. I think that's really a very cool way of thinking about it. I wanted to get to this issue of how you think about the mechanisms, because clearly that's really important. Maybe going back to that initial example you showed of the patient with a blind sight, and his ability to see, motion above some threshold of velocity, if you will, but not below it. And I wondered if maybe, and then also looking at some of the other examples you showed, I wonder if maybe some of our thinking is too corticocentric, because I wonder if the processing for that conscious content, meaning motion versus what the actual motion was, if that might be split up along cortical and subcortical areas. For instance, thinking of the motion, I wonder if there might be like subcortical areas in the brainstem or thalamus that could have picked that up, brought it into consciousness, but of course he's missing that critical V1
right.
area that could actually tell you what it was.
Yeah. So in essence, actually, people have, Petros Cerik and Michael Schmidt actually have looked at that fairly, in a lot of detail. And they actually came to the idea that you're postulating. So it seems to be that the supracolliculus is the one that actually relays that. Yeah. But what Michael also found out is that the conio pathway may also be important for this. The conio pathway, which was a completely,
That's very early.
Exactly. So it seems that the brain has multiple ways in which it can relay the information, and sometimes we have this linear view, like it goes from the retina to LGM to V1.
Right.
And that's it, right? Well, and this is okay, this is true, like 90% of the information goes that way.
Right.
But the brain is far smarter than that, right? And say if you have an injury, you may end up using some other pathways that, before you were not using, right? Or what is even more interesting, like Humphrey did experiments before where they would actually lesion B1 in one hemisphere and the monkey wouldn't move. Like it would be by all accounts blind. They would lesion B1 in the other hemisphere, so they would actually take both and the monkey would start moving as if it actually had seen. So there's also suppression between hemispheres that could be interfering, right? So there's a lot, so bottom line, I think that we are dealing with a complex system. And, we also have to think of how much it can reorganize as a function of experience, right? And maybe use that even, this is what we're trying to do now, like try to use that as an experimental, as an experimental tool, right? Like, can we just train somebody who was blindsided into seeing and see, like which pathways now started to, come into play, right? But, going back, like how much theories we have so far, there's not too many.
But
right?
I wonder, are we kind of maybe in some ways underestimating these subcortical areas? Like you mentioned, the superior cuticulatus. That was actually the area that popped in our mind because I know a priori that is an area where sensory and motor integration happens before it even reaches the cortex, right?
Yeah.
So that area is clearly decoupling some of the information before it even gets to the cortex. And so I just wonder if we're underestimating the contributions.
Oh, I fully agree with you. I think we are. And I think more and more studies these days have shown us that, say, the pulvinar it seems to be super relevant, for attention. So I think that there's a lot more. We're too much corticocentric, and we may actually be missing the key. Right.
Thank you. I was just...
I can hear you. Oh, I see.
Okay, so I was just wondering, because much of these studies that have been done in this line of research that you presented is focused on the visual system. And we, as humans, are different. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering how general these results are with respect to other senses.
That's an excellent question, and I just want to give you one. So the studies by Sandehan, like this idea of frontoparietal networks, they have done them in visual domain. I just want to give you in the visual domain, the auditory domain. So I think that for all that we know, why this is not. I'm not sure you don't see them. So these are detected and undetected sound. Here you're going to see. And these are visual and visible and invisible words. So people actually have done those studies to see like what, how replicable the results are across senses, right? And the same is also for somatosensory, for instance. They have looked at the same.
Yeah, because I think that my question is that when you relate the finding to a specific sense, so for instance with visual, are you in fact studying awareness as a general construct, or are you studying the visual? Mm-hmm. And then when you study auditory awareness, you do see that the mechanism is different because it's more biased by this sensory system that you have your steam about here. So it feels as though that you're studying something that's very specific to the visual system or very specific to the auditory system, and not to a construct of awareness.
So two parts to that question. So first, I think that you could think of mechanisms, say synchrony, for instance, and that's why one of my favorites, because regardless of where it occurs in the visual domain, like say if you're thinking of, I'm aware of motion, I would have synchrony in NT, right? If I am aware of syllables, I would have synchrony in STG, right? So in that case, where you're gonna have the synchrony will change, but the mechanism itself wouldn't, right? So that's one of those in which you could say, well, you're gonna find something which is the same across the senses, right? Now, and I had this discussion, like a long while with Wolf, because he said, well, then we should actually run the following experiment. We should, ask subjects to be aware by stimuli that are visual, the ones that are somatosensory, and blah, blah, blah. And all that is the same is going to be consciousness. And, at first sight, I thought, oh, that's a brilliant experiment. And then I thought, oh, that's a crappy experiment. Because, we know that there's something like a Jennifer Aniston neuron, right? So the Jennifer Aniston neurons are the ones that, where if you are in the hippocampus, and if you say Jennifer Aniston, it would spike. If you see Jennifer Aniston, you would spike. So those are just multisensory neurons, right? So then, we would end up with the Jennifer Aniston neuron, and it would end up with the conceptual system. And it's like, no, I don't want to study that, right? So, so then we have to be careful how we design experiments, because we may end up there as well, right? And we don't want, I don't want to end up there, right? I want to end up with a mechanism that allows me to see or to hear, they have awareness, right? So, yeah.
Great talk, thanks. In the case of the Chinese, your experiment with the Chinese language, could you put the slide, please?
Sure.
The one where you have the structure of the sentence. Mm-hmm. So for us, people who don't speak Chinese, even though we don't speak Chinese, so this means we don't recognize the words there, we can still recognize the phonological structure, sort of, like we can recognize syllables and phonemes, syllables, and also some sort of what is called morphophonology representation, which is not syntactic. It's the syntax within the sound pattern, kind of. And so I wonder why we don't show also activation at the 2 hertz, for example, which will be showing that we are somehow distinguishing between syllables in Chinese.
So in this
or 4 hertz.
So in this case, it's because the way in which we construct the material, so each word is a syllable, right? So we took advantage actually of the fact that because you want to pack 4 words in a second, it's actually difficult. So every syllable in this case is a word, right? Or we use monosyllabic words in the case of English, right? So there is no phonological patterns that allows the speakers to decode that. First. Second, since we didn't want to actually tap on those, because of course if I tell you something like this, you may not understand anything, but you say, okay, she was asking a question, right? So we actually want to get rid of the prosody, which gives you a lot of segmentational cues. So this is robotic language where all the informational cues that are intonational are gone, right? And the idea for that was important because if you are relying on the prosody, you may not be relying on putting elements together as we thought people should be doing, right? Which is syntax in this case. Right? So it wasn't a bug of the experiment; it was a feature of the experiment.
Yeah, I mean, they are monosyllabic.
Right.
And the other question is, could you put your experiment with the A, that you are showing like a pattern of noise, and then suddenly you see an A?
Yeah.
Okay, so. This kind of philosophical question, or conceptual one. Say that you have 1, 2, 3. Say that I see the A. I report that I see the A at the third example there. I'm not sure if you compare this third one with the one before, meaning the A a little bit less clear, or one step later. Do you think that you can say that the phenomenology changed, really? The phenomenological consciousness changed? Or it was something else? Something that we will say is the meaning, okay? Now I am aware that these white dots represent an A. Before that, I was seeing those. I was seeing that shape, triangular shape, okay? But I didn't know there was the letter A.
Yeah.
So from the phenomenological point of view, this is showing that some sort of a paradox, which is basically the idea that we are all the time aware phenomenologically, and it's something else that is changing.
So two answers to that question. So first, what we did here, exactly. So if I had actually drawn an A with all the borders, then of course, nothing really much significantly changed, right? So what we did was two things. A, we actually made it such that it was an illusory contour. So the A's actually aren't there. It's the density of the dots that actually makes these letters to pop out, right? So your perception actually does significantly change because of these illusory contours, right? So that's one thing. And then, to go,
Sorry, but the contrast should be just one step before you report, now I see an A.
Yeah, well, we did that as well.
And the changes were very little, probably.
No.
Visually.
No. Visually they were little, but in your perception they weren't.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the phenomenology. There was some little more white dots than before.
Well, so in the image, there were little more white dots. In your phenomenology, an A appeared, right?
Well,
which wasn't there before.
What I'm saying is that maybe in your phenomenology, there's also a little bit more whites, okay? But you activated the concept, letter A, which is not phenomenological. It's something else.
What I can tell you, so the best experiment we did to refute what you're saying is we took people that have grapheme letter synesthesia, right? So these are people that you present this A, and now they see it in red, right? In red. So they, or in yellow, or blue, or that's the strongest phenomenology that you can actually perceive, right? And so and we actually took people that have synesthesia to, in essence, now probe them with those stimuli and see when did they start seeing the color, right? Because that's something that is not in the image, that is, far beyond than what we have shown, right? So I think that's the best way to refute, to show that, your phenomenology actually can change far more than the image,
Well, they have this association in long-term memory with synesthesia. So somehow you're activating the concept too. It is precisely the activation of the concept that brings the other sensory modality into.
Yes and no, in the sense that, there is the so-called projectors synesthetes, which actually see the letter colored in the world, right? And these people that have this association, so they actually have it in their mind eyes. They go, this evoke an A, right? And the thing is that, since they actually haven't seen it before, so of course, we did the same experiment with the hysteresis, right? So now once they know that it's their A, they can keep it in memory because they have this extra association for longer, right? But the point is that beforehand, you cannot activate an A that you have never seen, right? You cannot put color or know, whatever, if you haven't seen that, right? You see, that's the key part when you actually start from not knowing anything.
I got one more mechanistic question. So I want to see if I understood it correctly. So are the precursors affecting the ability of the information to enter this global processing network?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what we think, and this is it's a work in progress, right? So my idea there is that there might be activity that is there that pushes you to go into one direction, but in and of itself may or may not be there, right? So you could have a baseline fluctuation, you could have an expectation before, you could have attention that made you to boost the activity that would have been required for consciousness, right? But in and of itself, it's not important, right? That's a distinction. That's why we call them precursors.
And in the case of the patient that was conscious when the dot was moving fast and not, so could be one of the sort of a precursor, the inability to see the slow motion, something in that processing slow motion that does not enable that information to be processed.
So what is known there is that there is different channels, right? So he was talking about the supercolliculus, and the information that it contains it's geared to certain spatial frequencies and geared to certain speed of motion, right? And that's why the idea there is the information didn't get there because it couldn't use that pathway, right? That's the...
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia, for your talk. I want to know if you have your experiment or you know what about, because most of these studies are with external stimuli. But we also have, as you mentioned, internal stimuli. I'm thinking about, for example, emotions. You at some point are aware or conscious of certain emotion. I'm angry or whatever. Do you think, they converge in a certain state that's consciousness, or an alternative, do they create consciousness in parallel ways?
That's a good question. So what you're saying is that are they using the same pathways or the same whatever machinery, say,
because
as opposed to,
for example, what Patrick shown that when patients lost consciousness, they turn to not be aware of he have a tone earlier than when they hear the name. And some other people in the lab are working with minimal conscious state patients, and they do see some activity in EEG when not for any stimuli, but for example when a relative tells the patient's name, that you can argue that that's strongly emotional, and maybe that changes in the EEG are reflecting another way that it's activated because of this inner state.
Look, the answer to that is that I don't know. My hunch is that it may not necessarily be different, but what could be different is the fact that if you think of a network and just like LTP, and like how information is engraved in the landscape, right? So for your name, you need very little information to get there, right? For something new, you would need a lot. And if say repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, that stimuli may end up being like your name, right? So it could be that it's just something that it has been there for longer, and therefore it has a different plasticity. And that's why, I'm really interested in how much our brain changes as a function of learning, because I do think that that's going to give us a cue as of, what entered into awareness earlier, what will not enter, how
efficiency, but it looks like when you are trained for saying,
right, exactly,
you use at least less areas.
Exactly. That's. But in the case of the emotional stimuli, you may also think that they are, or nociceptive stimuli for that matter. They may actually be using different pathways, right? Because those are really biologically relevant. You see, whether I see red or not may not kill me, right? But if, if I'm burning, that will kill me, right? So it may actually also be different because of the biological relevance.
Yeah, right? But you can argue, for that I have the spinal cord. I had a reflex.
That could also be,
But I'm asking you because maybe pain, not necessarily nociception, but pain is a very subjective. And maybe it's a mixture of these two pathways, if there are one perceptual part or external stimuli pathway and one internal.
That's why we end up studying these people that have synesthesia, right? Because we wanted to actually use those cases where it was not something in the outer world, it was something that they would bring in, right? As opposed to, or hallucinations, would be like the other. My impression is that it's the conversion of all those that would give us a cue, right? Because it should be the same. At least my default hypothesis would be that they should be the same mechanisms, right? God knows.
Lucia, thank you for your magnificent presentation. I was wondering, don't know if you know, is there any evidence or research being carried about the molecular mechanisms involved in conscious processes right now?
I don't know about it. I know that there is people working on the quantum theories and stuff like that, right? I'm not sure how much weight people give to those theories, and I think that it's more for like sociological reasons, because it's not that the other people know the answer, right? But they tend to be disregarded, and the reason for that is because people think that you can maybe change the molecular makeup, and nothing really changes in your mind necessarily, right? So the question of the same, so this boils down to the question of what is the relevant level at which you think your phenomenon will show up, right? And that's why people think that, it's not also at the level of a single neuron. Because, a lot of neurons actually died every day, and we don't lose consciousness, right? So that's why people think that it's either at the level of the areas, or at the communication between areas, or something along those lines, right? So it's kind of like the granularity problem. Like, at what level? We don't really know, right? But the hunch is that molecular may not necessarily be the right one.
Well, it's a difficult focus, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much.